Hey, I'm Lauren from TastyPC.tv, and today I'm doing a review of both the Mini-ITX and Micro-ATX versions of the Bitfenix Colossus, which are two cases which look identical from the outside but have very different internals to allow for the different form factors. So let's get started. So then here I've got both the Mini-ITX and Micro-ATX versions of the Bitfenix Colossus, and as you can see from this angle they do look identical. But they've both got this like soft touch rubberized plastic running across the top and down the front of both of them, which I do really like. And then we've also got this LED strip which runs across the front and then down each side. And you can change the colour of the LED by clicking this button here. And then you can choose to have it either completely off like this, or glow red, or blue, or green. And then there's also a setting where you can have it pulsate red slowly for a bit, and then pulsate blue slowly for a bit, and then pulsate green slowly for a bit, and then go back to red, which is pretty cool, but I think my favourite of the LEDs is definitely blue. And then we've also got the shiny Bitfenix logo, which I have to say I think these cases do really look beautiful. But both of the cases have got this kind of door at the front, which is just held on by magnets, and in both of the cases you can fit different things in the front, so I'll talk about that when I'm taking us for a look around each of the separate cases, but they can both fit a single 5.25 inch optical bay in the top, and the front intakes air through these slits in the kind of door here, obviously through here, and then through this grille here. And in the top of both of the cases we've got this dust filter which just kind of pops off like so, and it's easy to remove for like maintenance, obviously to clean. And in the top of both cases you can fit two 120mm fans, and I'll talk more about rad options later in the video. Now with both the side panels, they are both metal with the LED strips running down them, and they both remove with two thumb screws. On the left hand side they're both completely plain, but on the right hand side they've both got the front I/O, which is two USB 3 ports, the headphone and microphone jacks, the restart button, and the power button. Which does mean that the front I/O cables are coming off of the side panels, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. But yeah, so this is kind of like the only similarities that the cases really have. I'm now going to take you for a closer look around the Mini-ITX version. So I've removed the side panel without the front I/O, and you can see inside the Mini-ITX version of the Bitfenix Colossus. So obviously here I've got my graphics card, and I have removed the top hard drive cage, and with it gone I've got about 330mm of space to work with, but with the top hard drive cage in, you've only got about 180mm worth of space. Now the top hard drive cage can fit either 3.5 inch or 2.5 inch hard drives or solid-state drives. And the bottom cage, which is also removable if you want, can fit two, but I like to keep it in because you can hide cables behind it, and you can see that I've got two solid-state drives in here at the mo. But it does mean you can fit 5 hard drives in, which is cool because it means that even though I think this case looks more like it's been designed for gamers, it would make like a cute little NAS file server. But at the bottom you've got a mount for a 2.5 inch drive, and then on this like power supply bracket you've got two mounts for two 2.5 inch drives. So I'm just going to remove the graphics card quick so you can have a better look inside the case. So now that I've removed my GPU, you can better see inside the case, and as you can see it is essentially just like a Bitfenix Prodigy or Phenom, just with like a different outer frame. But for the power supply I'm using a 160mm long fully modular AX760i, which at first I did think would be difficult to fit, but I found that as long as you decided what cables you wanted first, plugged them in first, and decided what kind of side you wanted them on, so like I've got all the cables going that way apart from the GPU cable which I've got coming out the front, and you like thread them down the sides you want them to go first before you slide the power supply in, then you have absolutely no trouble fitting it at all. The only issue is that if I do ever want to plug in an additional cable, that will be a little bit of a nightmare. But to be honest, in this build, I don't see any reason why I'd ever need to plug in another cable, unless like I completely changed the cooler to allow me to put the optical bay back in, so I could use like a fan controller which needed a Molex connector or something. But other than something like that, I don't see any reason why I'd ever need an additional cable. But then with cooling options, you've got a clearance of 175mm for your CPU cooler, and as you can see I fit a H100i intaking in the roof, which was easy to fit with the tubes going up this way. And in the roof of the case you can fit either a 120 or 240mm rad, or two 120mm fans as I said before. Now in the rear of the case you can fit either a 120 or 140mm fan, or 120 or 140mm rad, and here I've got a 140mm red LED fan because I wanted like a nice red glow coming out of the back of the case to match the LED strip, which I am going to be talking about more, or I'll be looking at more in detail later on in the video. But when you get the case it does come with a 120mm fan fitted to the rear of the case, as well as a 120mm fan kind of here at the bottom of the front. But at the front of the case, you can fit either two 120mm or a single 140, 200 or 230mm fan. And here I've got a 200mm fan, just so you can kind of see. I have to say though, I do think the airflow at the front of the case is a little bit restrictive, as the air's got to come through these slits in the top of the door, then through the slits in the side of the door, then through that like dust filtered fan grille that I showed you before, which stops right here, making it especially bad if you've got like a 120mm fan at the bottom down here, because then the air's then got to come through this thin gap here, and then finally come through like the grille that the fan's actually mounted on, so it does just seem quite restrictive to me. But in the front of the case, you can fit either a 120, a 140, a 200 or 240mm rad, and I did fit an 86mm thick Monster 240 in both push and push-pull, just so you can see kind of how thick you can go. Now obviously with a rad in the front, you can't have either of the hard drive cages in. Also with this rad, I found given how low kind of the bottom end tank comes, you lose the bottom 2.5-inch mount, but you do get to keep the two 2.5-inch mounts on the power supply bracket. Also, obviously remember, the thicker you come out with a rad in the front, the less length you're going to have for your graphics card. You're also going to have to get pretty creative with where you've got your res and pump, which makes something like a Swift-Tech Apogee Drive 2 perfect for a little case like this, which is just where they've got like the pump installed in the water block. But yeah, so I don't have the optical drive at the moment, or the optical bay I should say, sorry, but if you do have the optical bay, and then you cannot have either a 240 or 200mm rad in the front of the case, because they come into the space where the optical bay is. The same as with a rad in the roof, if you've got the optical bay in, then the 240 rad obviously comes into it. You can have a 120mm rad in the roof with the optical bay, as long as whatever's in the optical bay doesn't stick out past the end of it, which means you've only got about 160mm for whatever it is that you want to go in your optical bay. Now with a rad in the roof, when it comes to thickness, once again I fit an 86mm thick Monster 240 in both pull and push-pull, and where the fan stops, about here, to the motherboard you've got roughly 60mm of space for like clearance of your memory and fittings and stuff. Now even with like a thick monster rad like that, you can still have the bottom hard drive cage in, but if you only go for a thin 30mm thick rad with a single set of fans, then you can actually have both hard drive cages in, which is pretty cool. Although this top right fan here, obviously the airflow will be restricted to it. Now with a rad in the roof, if you're using the fan mounts on this side, then you're not able to fit a rad and a set of fans, or well, a rad and fan, in the rear of the case, even with the end tank on this side. And the same if you're using the fan mounts on this side, then you cannot fit either a 240 or 200mm rad in the front, even if they're both 30mm thick, because then the fans actually want to occupy like the same space and time. So I know that of course you're not actually going to be fitting rads as thick as Monsters. I just thought they'd be a great example to use, as they're currently the thickest rad you can get, and then you can kind of see, you know, just how thick you can go. And then just lastly, at the back of the case, we've got the 120 or 140mm fan mount, two PCIe slots so you can have a dual slot GPU, this little cover which uses a toolless mounting system. I don't know why they've used these cupboards, but I always just find them really like irritatingly fiddly to use. And then we've also got this bracket for your power supply, where you secure the power supply to the bracket with normal screws before sliding it in, and then once you've slid it in, you secure the bracket to the case with thumb screws. And then at the bottom of the case, we've just got this dust filter for the power supply, which just slides straight out. We've got the mount for the solid-state drive in the bottom of the case. We've got the screws for the bottom hard drive cage, and to get to the far two screws, you do actually have to take off the feet to do so. And we do have these 4 feet, which have like rubber bottoms, and then this metal bit that kind of runs around them, which looks really nice. And if you don't want the feet just to be unscrewed, if you want them permanently to be stuck on, then you can just peel off this stuff and just stick them down permanently. So then moving on to the Micro-ATX version of the Bitfenix Colossus, you can see the internals are very different to the Mini-ITX version to allow for the bigger board. But because of that, the amount of space you have is restricted, and therefore you are limited to what you can do with your build and the parts you can put in the case. I have noticed quite a lot though that when manufacturers make Mini-ITX cases which are physically large enough to be able to fit a larger board, a lot of people will just bitch and moan about if it can fit a Micro-ATX board, why didn't they make it so that it's a Micro-ATX case rather than a Mini-ITX case? And they see that because of how big it is and because it could fit a Micro-ATX board, it's therefore kind of pointless as a Mini-ITX case. But the thing that these people don't kind of consider is the restrictions you incur if you do so. And I think these restrictions are visible in this case, and for that reason I'm just not very keen on it. But looking around it, firstly with a motherboard, they have fit it upside down to allow you to fit a larger board. And this is actually the first case I've worked in with an inverted board, so that was quite an interesting change for me. But at the top of the case, you can fit two 120mm fans, as I said before, and these do come into the motherboard area slightly. So if you had a GPU fit in the bottom slot, then the gap between the GPU and the fan would be very small, so the airflow there would be quite restricted. In the rear of the case, you can fit either a single 120 or 140mm fan or rad, and here I fit a H80 because I wanted both of the rigs to be as comparable as possible, so they've both got all-in-one liquid coolers. Although you do have roughly about 175mm of space to work with for your CPU cooler's clearance. I have to say though that even though the Mini-ITX version of the case is like really great for water cooling, you've got loads of options to work with, with the Micro-ATX case it's not really an option. But in the floor, now you can use this for cooling if you want to, for either two 120mm or a single 140, 200 or 230mm fan, or if you prefer you can use it for storage and fit two 3.5-inch drives, or you could probably fit a drive and a fan if you wanted to. But if you do decide to use it for storage, the case comes with like a little magnetic heat shield which you stick to the bottom of the case to make it kind of have like a solid floor rather than ventilation. Although if I did that, I'd only have two fans intaking and one exhausting, and I think if this had been a dual GPU rig, then that just wouldn't have been enough airflow. But as well as the floor for storage, you've also got this little bracket here, which can fit either two 3.5-inch or three 2.5-inch drives, and that just sits here. And with that, you can fit a total of 7 storage drives. Now when it comes to the power supply, I'm using a 160mm long fully modular power supply, and it fits in this bracket here, intaking from the front and exhausting in the bottom. So if you did have fans in the bottom, you wouldn't want them intaking and bringing the heat back in. You'd kind of have to have the case's airflow inverted too, where it intakes in the roof and then exhausts from the bottom and rear of the case. Now with this case, you do have to be very careful when it comes to choosing a power supply and your graphics card. I originally wanted to go for a 780 in this case, but I found that it just, because of the position of the power supply's connectors and cables, it just wouldn't physically fit. And this is the only card that I had which was short enough to be able to fit that doesn't have a water block in it. If I had used a non-modular or semi-modular power supply, then the cables would have been further back and it would have helped a little bit, but then I would have had even more cables to work with, so. Now this top optical bay is removable to give you more space, but I like to keep it in because I find it's just kind of keeping my cables down and in check, and if I removed it, they'd probably just like flail up and either like end up sitting on the GPU or kind of sticking up into the fans. Also with this case, obviously one of the biggest selling features for going for the Micro-ATX form factor rather than the Mini-ITX form factor is that you can have like a dual GPU system. However, given how much length you've got to work with, having a second GPU in this rig would definitely be a hassle, which I think is quite sad. Although I have fit a capture card just so you can just to kind of show off that you do have more PCIe slots to work with. Now one thing that does really grate me about the Micro-ATX version of the Bitfenix Colossus is that the front I/O cables are on this side panel. Even though it's the same with the Mini-ITX version, with the Mini-ITX version, they're essentially on the rear side panel. So as soon as you're plugged in all your drives, you can put in the side panel and then go around the other side of the case, plug in the front I/O cables on that side and work on the rest of the rig from that side of the case. So that was, the side that we were looking in the case at. Whereas with this case, the front I/O cables are on kind of the front side panel. So once you've kind of finished with your build, you've got the fun of trying to balance the side panel somewhere where you try and plug them in. And then when you put the side panel on, you have no idea where they're going to end up, and they are quite long cables. So they could end up, pushed up against a fan, which, you wouldn't know until you turn your rig on and heard the horrible noise. And this just really irritates me. I think there's no reason for it to be on the front side panel rather than the rear one, other than just to cut costs and be able to use the same side panel as with the Mini-ITX case. So then finishing my tour around the Micro-ATX version of the Bitfenix Colossus. With the Pcie bracket here, I find that not only is it really fiddly to fit, but it doesn't do a very good job of securing your cards. I would have much prefer if they'd used like a more conventional just screw method instead, especially as I can see people choosing to use this case for LANs. Also, you can see that even though the power supply is mounted inside the front of the case, you've got the mains connector at the back of the case, and that's because you've got a cable running along the bottom of the case. So moving on to the conclusion, firstly with the Mini-ITX version of the Bitfenix Colossus, it's a really great case to work in, it's very easy to work in, you've got quite a few walk-along options. And I've been using the case now for my own personal build for the last few months, with the specs in this video, and it's a really great case, I've loved using it, just having it sat in the corner, glowing red. I definitely think that it's on par with the 250D, and I think I'm going to give it my Tasty Award, which is my highest award, kind of like Editor's Choice. With the Micro-ATX version, however, firstly it's not the easiest to build in, not because of the inverted motherboard, but because you just don't have as much room to work with. Also, I just can't help but feel like it's a modded version of the Mini-ITX case rather than kind of like a standalone case in its own right. Like, it uses the same front as the Mini-ITX case, even though you're never going to stick a fan in the front because that's where the power supply goes. Also, the front I/O cables being on like the main side panel is just crazy. There's no reason for them not to be on the back one. They could have just swapped it over. And I feel like they've just tried to use as many elements of the Mini-ITX case as possible just to cut costs, which I know all manufacturers do, but I just can't help but feel like the Mini-ITX version of the case has got this really like refined design, whereas the Micro-ATX version has just been kind of made by some randomer in a shed. I know that sounds pretty harsh, and I know that, the whole history where they made the Prodigy M after people were saying, why didn't they make it a Micro-ATX case instead? And it's the same thing here, but it's just kind of how I feel. But that's not saying it's a bad case. Like, if you go for short GPUs and you're careful with the parts you pick, then you can have a pretty sweet dual GPU system with 4 hard drives and 3 SSDs. It's just that after falling in love with the Mini-ITX version, I just, I was just expecting so much more and was let down by the amount of compromises you've got to make trying to fit a Micro-ATX case or build in a case of this size. But yeah, so that was my review of both the Mini-ITX and Micro-ATX versions of the Bitfenix Colossus. If you like the video, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already and you want to see more of my videos. And thanks for watching.